As Elder Chidi made his way to Mama Ada's house that evening, his face was etched with worry. The weight of the news he carried seemed to slow his steps. He knew the information he bore would bring no comfort to Mama Ada and Mike, and the thought of their disappointment weighed heavily on his heart. As he approached the modest dwelling, Elder Chidi couldn't help but reflect on the source of this unfortunate situation. Elder Sylvester, known throughout the community for his ruthlessness and penchant for cruelty, Elder Sylvester had once again proven his reputation well-earned. With a heavy sigh, Elder Chidi knocked on the door. Mama Ada opened it, her eyes immediately registering the somber expression on the elder's face. Despite the flicker of worry that crossed her features, she managed a warm smile. "Elder Chidi, please come in," she said, ushering him inside. "Have a seat. Can I offer you some water?" Elder Chidi shook his head as he settled into a chair. "Thank you, Mama Ada, but I'm fine." Mama Ada sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Elder Chidi," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "you don't look happy. What news do you bring of my husband?" Before Elder Chidi could respond, Mike emerged from his room. He greeted the elder respectfully before taking a seat on a nearby wooden stool, his unseeing eyes turned in the direction of Elder Chidi's voice. Elder Chidi took a deep breath. "I must be honest with you both. The situation. It's not looking good for Mr. James." Mama Ada's eyes widened in fear. "Oh no," she whispered. "Why do you say that, Elder?" "I didn't get to see Mr. James face to face," Elder Chidi explained. The king seemed willing to consider leniency, but he paused, his face darkening. "Elder Sylvester is the real problem here." Mike leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Elder Sylvester? Who is he? And why would he make things worse for my father?" Mama Ada, who had been quiet, spoke up. "Elder Sylvester is one of the king's closest advisors, Mike. He's been in that position for many years now." "Indeed," Elder Chidi nodded. "And he's known for his heartlessness and wickedness. As I pleaded Mr. James's case to the king, the first could see him considering my words. But then Elder Sylvester spoke up, poisoning the king's mind against your father." Mike's hands clenched into fists. "But why? What does he have against our family?" Elder Chidi shook his head sadly. "It's not personal, Mike. Elder Sylvester simply delights in others' misfortune. He sees kindness as weakness and pushes for harsh punishments at every opportunity." Mama Ada's voice quavered as she asked, "So what happens now, Elder Chidi? Is there any hope for my husband?" Elder Chidi leaned forward, his voice low but determined. "All is not lost yet. The king told me he would consider what I said. We must pray that he sees reason and doesn't let Elder Sylvester's cruel suggestions sway him." A heavy silence fell over the room as they all contemplated the gravity of the situation. After a moment, Elder Chidi stood, signaling the end of his visit. "I've shared all I know," he said softly. "Now we must wait and hope for the best." Mama Ada rose as well, grasping Elder Chidi's hands in hers. "Thank you, Elder," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Your efforts on our behalf mean more than you know." Mike stepped forward, his hand outstretched. Elder Chidi took it, surprised by the young man's firm grip. "Elder Chidi," Mike said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude, "I can never repay you for what you've done for our family. Thank you." Elder Chidi smiled, touched by Mike's words. He could see the man Mike was becoming strong, respectful, and deeply caring. It gave him hope for the future, even in these dark times. As Elder Chidi turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Keep faith," he said softly. "Your father is a good man. We must believe that justice will prevail." With those final words of encouragement, Elder Chidi stepped out into the cool evening air. As he walked away from Mama Ada's house, He couldn't shake the feeling that this ordeal was far from over. The battle against Elder Sylvester's influence had only just begun, and Elder Chidi knew he would need all his wisdom and courage to see it through. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ornate palace walls, King George and Elder Sylvester sat in deep discussion. The air was thick with tension, the fate of a man hanging in the balance. King George leaned forward, his eyes narrow with determination. "I believe it's time we decide on Mr. James's punishment," he declared, his voice firm. Elder Sylvester's eyes glinted with interest. "Indeed, my lord. What did you have in mind?" The king stroked his chin thoughtfully. "I'm thinking a public flogging in the village square would serve our purpose well. It will send a clear message to others about the consequences of fraternizing with the Yoruba people." Elder Sylvester nodded, a sly smile playing on his lips. "An excellent choice, my lord. Although, if I recall correctly, I did suggest something similar earlier." King George waved his hand dismissively. Yes, I remember. But now, considering Elder Chidi's explanation about Mr. James being new to our community, I believe this punishment strikes the right balance." Elder Sylvester bowed his head in agreement. "Your will is my command, my lord. I stand by your decision, whatever it may be." The king's face softened slightly at his advisor's words. "Very good. I'll set the date for his punishment perhaps tomorrow, or the day after. Does that timeline suit you, old friend?" "Of course, my lord," Elder Sylvester replied smoothly. "It's perfect." King George nodded, satisfied with the plan. He stood, stretching slightly. "Well, I think I'll retire to my chambers for some rest. Good night, Elder Sylvester." As the king turned to leave, Elder Sylvester suddenly remembered something. "My king, wait," he called out. King George paused, turning back with a raised eyebrow. "Yes? What is it?" Elder Sylvester moved closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "What about the instructions you gave to King Oba? Has he carried them out? Has Mr. Akin been punished?" A look of surprise crossed King George's face. "Oh, I had completely forgotten about that. My dear friend," he said, smiling warmly at Elder Sylvester, "this is why you're invaluable to me. How could I have overlooked something so crucial?" Elder Sylvester preened under the praise. "It's my duty to assist you, my lord." King George nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, we'll discuss this matter further at our next meeting. Thank you for reminding me." As King George disappeared into his chambers, Elder Sylvester remained in the hallway, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. He turned and made his way out of the palace, his mind already racing with plans and schemes. As Elder Sylvester made his way home through the bustling streets of the village, the sound of children's laughter caught his attention. He paused, watching the little ones play, their faces alight with joy and innocence. A wistful smile crossed his weathered face as memories of his own childhood flooded back. Those were the days, he murmured to himself, shaking his head. Long gone now. As he continued his journey, lost in thought, he didn't notice Mama Ada approaching from the opposite direction. She balanced a heavy basket of fresh vegetables and fruits on her head, her face set with determination as she headed to the market. Their paths were destined to cross, and as they drew nearer, Elder Sylvester's eyes narrowed. His thoughts turned dark. "You lucky woman," he mused silently. "If it were up to me, you and your foolish husband would be banished from this community forever." Mama Ada, however, had other plans. The words of Elder Chidi echoed in her mind, fueling a fire of indignation that had been smoldering for days. As they came face to face, something inside her snapped. With a swift motion, she lowered her basket to the ground. Her eyes blazed as she thrust an accusing finger at Elder Sylvester. "You," she cried, her voice trembling with anger. You wicked, evil, shameless man. You're nothing but a sad, bitter old fool that nobody loves." Elder Sylvester stood rooted to the spot, his mouth agape in shock. Never in all his years had anyone dared to speak to him this way. But Mama Ada wasn't finished. "That's why you have no children, no grandchildren to call your own. Your heart is too twisted, your soul too dark." She took a step closer, her voice rising. "Just because you're friends with the king doesn't give you the right to punish others and make their lives miserable." For a moment, silence fell over the street. Passers-by stopped to stare, their eyes wide with disbelief at the confrontation unfolding before them. Elder Sylvester's face contorted with rage as he found his voice. "Old woman," he spat, his words dripping with venom. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I am a red chieftaincy elder." And so what Mama Ada retorted, standing her ground. "What will you do?" A cruel smile spread across Elder Sylvester's face. "Oh, you'll see," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You'll pay dearly for this, I promise you with that." He turned on his heel and stormed away, leaving a stunned crowd in his wake. As Elder Sylvester's form disappeared into the distance, the gravity of what she had done began to sink in for Mama Ada. The fire of her anger gave way to a cold dread that settled in the pit of her stomach. "Oh no," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "What have I done?" A kind-faced woman from the crowd approached her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Mama Ada," she said gently, "that was very brave of you, but—" But foolish Mama Ada finished, her voice hollow. "I let my anger get the best of me." And now she trailed off, unable to voice her fears. The woman nodded sympathetically. "Elder Sylvester is not known for his forgiveness. I hope you know that?" Mama Ada nodded numbly, picking up her basket with trembling hands. As she made her way to the market, her mind raced with the possible consequences of her actions. How would this affect Mr. James? What new hardships had she brought upon her family? As he reached his home, Elder Sylvester slammed the door behind him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "How dare she?" he seethed, pacing back and forth. "That insolent woman, she'll rue the day she crossed me." He paused, a malevolent glint in his eye. "Oh yes, she'll pay. They'll all pay." A cruel smile spread across his face as he began to formulate his revenge. In the quiet Yoruba village, Mr. Akin trudged into his humble hut, his body heavy with exhaustion. Without a word, he sank into a wooden chair, his weary gaze fixed on the thatched roof above. The day's events had taken their toll, leaving him drained and restless. Hearing the familiar sound of footsteps, Mama Kiki emerged from their bedroom. Her eyes immediately fell on her husband's slumped form, concern etching deep lines on her face. "My love," she said softly, settling beside him. "What happened?" "I heard the royal guards came to the farm and took you away." Mr. Akin turned to face her, his breath still labored. "My darling, it's been quite a day, I must say. Yes, the guards did come for me at the farm, but how did you hear about this?" Mama Kiki waved her hand dismissively. "That's not important right now. Please tell me what happened." With a deep sigh, Mr. Akin recounted the day's events, from his arrest at the farm to his audience with King Oba. As he finished his tale, he shook his head ruefully. "I told you this would cause problems for us. Going to the Igbo community was a mistake. I said as much." "Yes, I know, my love," Mama Kiki replied, her voice soft but firm. "But it had to be done for Kiki's sake." "I suppose you're right," Mr. Akin conceded with a sigh. He glanced around the room, suddenly aware of their daughter's absence. "Where is Kiki? I haven't seen her." Mama Kiki's face softened with maternal concern. "She's in her room. After hearing of your arrest, she cried herself to sleep. The poor child was exhausted." "Oh, my poor, Lovely daughter, Mr. Akin murmured. After a moment he asked, and what of her and Mike? Any news? Mama Kiki shook her head. Nothing yet. Mr. Akin nodded slowly. I suspected as much. I fear Mike and Mr. James are facing their own difficulties in the Igbo community. From what King Oba said, I gather their king is not as understanding as ours. Oh, Mama Kiki exclaimed, her voice tinged with sadness. To think they're going through all this for something so small. We were just trying to help our children, weren't we? Mr. Akin's face hardened slightly. Well, it doesn't matter. A rule is a rule, and we disregarded it. There must be consequences. Speaking of consequences, Mama Kiki ventured, what did the king say your punishment would be? Mr. Akin leaned back in his chair, his eyes once again on the ceiling. He didn't specify. He said he and his cabinet members would discuss it and inform me through his guards when they've decided. But he assured me it wouldn't be too severe, given my standing in the community. Our contributions in providing food and employment have worked in our favor, it seems. Mama Kiki's eyes widened. So if we weren't significant members of this community, our punishment would have been more severe. Wow. So much for rules and regulations, she said, her tone a mixture of surprise and disappointment. A heavy silence fell between them, each lost in their own thoughts. Mr. Akin remained reclined in his chair, his gaze distant, while Mama Kiki sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. After a long moment, Mr. Akin spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. You know, despite everything, I can't bring myself to regret what we did. Seeing Kiki happy, knowing we tried to bridge this divide for our children, it means something. Mama Kiki reached out, taking her husband's hand in hers. I feel the same way. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. For Kiki, for our family. As the sun began to set outside their window, casting long shadows across the room, Mr. Akin and Mama Kiki sat in companionable silence. The weight of uncertainty hung heavy in the air, but beneath it all, a current of love and determination ran strong. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them as one. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dusty village paths, Mama Ada made her way home from the market. Her mind was a whirlwind of worry and regret, the confrontation with Elder Sylvester replaying in her thoughts like a relentless nightmare. With each step, the weight of her actions seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible burden. What have I done? She whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the evening sounds of the village. How will Mike react when he learns how I may have ruined any chance of his father returning home without severe punishment? As she approached their modest hut, Mama Ada took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. Entering quietly, she found Mike sitting on his bed, his unseeing eyes fixed on a point in the distance, lost in thought. "Mama, is that you?" Mike asked, his head turning slightly at the sound of her footsteps. "Yes, Mike. I'm back," Mama Ada replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "How was your day?" Mike was silent for a moment before responding, his voice flat. "Not so good. And you, Mama, how was yours?" Mama Ada hesitated, fear gripping her heart as she contemplated how to break the news. Before she could speak, Mike's perceptive nature kicked in. "Mama, you sound worried. What is it? Please, talk to me," he urged, concern evident in his voice. Mama Ada marveled at her son's intuition. Even without sight, he could read her emotions so clearly. Pride swelled in her chest, momentarily overshadowing her anxiety. Taking a deep breath, she began, "Mike, I made a mistake earlier today on my way to the market." "What happened, Mama?" "What mistake?" Mike asked, leaning forward with interest. Slowly, haltingly, Mama Ada recounted her encounter with Elder Sylvester, her voice trembling as she described the harsh words she had hurled at the influential elder. As she finished her tale, Mike burst out, his voice a mix of shock and disbelief. "What? Mama, why would you do something like that? You know how Elder Sylvester is, how vindictive he can be. Why would you insult and disrespect him that way?" Mama Ada's composure crumbled, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Mike. It was the devil's work. I was just so angry seeing him walk around like he's a good man when he's caused us so much pain." And so Mike interrupted, his voice sharp with frustration. "I can't believe you, Mama. How could you be so reckless?" Without another word, Mike stood up and headed for the door. Mama Ada reached out, her voice pleading, "I'm sorry, son. Please don't go out. I'm sorry." But Mike was already gone, his footsteps fading as he made his way down the familiar path to the stream, his favorite place for finding peace and quiet. Left alone in the hut, Mama Ada sank to the floor, her body racked with sobs. The weight of her actions, the fear for her husband's fate, and now the disappointment in her son's eyes, it all came crashing down on her at once. By the stream, Mike sat in contemplative silence, grappling with the new complications his mother's actions had brought to their already difficult situation. In the grand palace of King George, the air was thick with the aroma of a sumptuous feast. The king had just finished a lavish meal of chicken and rice and was making his way to his wooden throne, a toothpick dangling from his lips. As he was about to sit, the doors burst open, and Elder Sylvester stormed in, his face contorted with rage. King George, surprised by the sudden intrusion, raised an eyebrow. "My friend," he said, his voice tinged with concern, "what seems to be the problem? You look most upset." Elder Sylvester, forgoing his usual respectful greeting, launched into an angry tirade. "My lord, I am beyond furious. That wretched woman, Mama Ada, had the audacity to embarrass me and call me names in public." The king's brow furrowed in confusion. "Mama Ada? Who might that be?" Mr. James's wife, Elder Sylvester, spat, his eyes blazing with fury. King George leaned forward, intrigued. But why would she do such a thing? Elder Sylvester paced back and forth, his hands clenched into fists. "She accused me of keeping Mr. James imprisoned and poisoning your mind against him." The king's face showed a mixture of surprise and skepticism. Noticing this, Elder Sylvester decided to embellish and make up his own story, hoping to provoke a stronger reaction from the king, because he felt the king wasn't taking the situation as serious as he was. So he had to lie about what actually happened to provoke the king more. "But that's not all, my lord," he continued, his voice dripping with feigned distress. She spat in my face and threw dirt on my clothes, calling me wicked. And then..." He paused for dramatic effect. "She had the mind and audacity to say that you, King George, are the reason your wife and children are dead. She claimed you killed them and now seek to punish anyone who has a happy family." The effect was immediate. King George's face turned a deep shade of red, his eyes flashing with unbridled anger. He leapt from his throne, pacing furiously. "How dare she?" he roared. "How dare she say such things?" Elder Sylvester suppressed a smile, pleased that his plan was working. "My lord, what shall we do about this outrage?" King George bellowed for his guards. "Bring me Mr. James at once," he commanded. Minutes later, Mr. James was brought before them, confusion and fear evident on his face. The king, still seething, pointed an accusing finger at Mr. James. "You and your family have brought shame upon me and this community. For this, you are all banished." Mr. James's eyes widened in shock. "Please, your highness," he pleaded, falling to his knees. "I beg you, don't do this. We have nowhere else to go. This is our home." Elder Sylvester interjected, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You and your wife should have thought of that before your actions." Mr. James looked up, bewildered. My wife? What has my wife done? King George recounted the fabricated story, his voice rising with each word. Mr. James listened in stunned silence, realizing the gravity of the situation. Elder Sylvester, seeing his opportunity, stepped forward. For these transgressions, both you and your wife will receive 25 lashes each in the village square before your banishment. This will serve as a reminder to others never to make such a grave mistake. King George nodded his approval, too blinded by anger to see through the deception. Mr. James stood silently, no longer pleading or apologizing. He knew that the punishment, though based on lies, was too severe to be overturned. Guards Elder Sylvester called. "Take this man away. Prepare him for his punishment, which will take place tomorrow evening." As Mr. James was led away, King George added, "Let this be a lesson to all who would dare to bring outsiders into our community or speak ill of their king." As the sun began to set over the Yoruba community, Kiki sat on her bed, her heart heavy with sadness and confusion. Days had passed since she'd last spoken to Mike, and the silence between them was becoming unbearable. Tears welled up in her eyes as she made a sudden decision to leave the house for a stroll. "Maybe some fresh air will help clear my head," she murmured to herself, wiping away a stray tear. As she walked down the familiar path, her mind drifted to the stream, their favorite spot, where she and Mike had shared so many peaceful moments. A fleeting thought crossed her mind, what if Mike was there too? But she quickly dismissed it. "No way," she said aloud, shaking her head. "What are the chances he'd be there right when I'm going?" But as Kiki approached the stream, her eyes widened in disbelief. There, sitting by the water's edge, was Mike. She froze, her heart racing. "What do I do now?" she whispered, suddenly unsure of herself. For a full minute, Kiki stood rooted to the spot, debating whether to approach him or turn back. Finally, gathering her courage, she decided to seize this unexpected opportunity. As she moved closer, her footsteps crunching softly on the gravel, Mike's head perked up. Without turning, he called out, "Kiki, is that you?" Kiki stopped in her tracks, surprised. "How? How did you know it was me?" Mike didn't respond, instead returning to his pensive posture, his unseeing eyes fixed on the flowing water. Kiki, undeterred by his silence, pressed on. "Mike, I know you're upset, but can I join you?" After a moment's hesitation, Mike replied softly, "Okay, if you want to." A small smile tugged at Kiki's lips as she settled down beside him, hope blossoming in her chest that perhaps they could finally bridge the gap between them. Or so she taught to herself.
Write the word "continue" in the comment section if you want the next part, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed watching. Kindly click the subscribe button, like, comment, and share this video. Watch out for more intriguing and eye-catching videos from your favorite YouTube channel.